The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal towers of Kepler Station. The space station hung in the void between three star systems, serving as neutral ground for the galaxy's most important academy. Students from dozens of worlds walked through the gleaming corridors, their various forms creating a strange parade of galactic life. Jake Murphy adjusted his backpack and tried not to stare at his classmates. Even after 6 months at the Galactic Academy of Interspecies Studies, he still felt amazed by the diversity around him. A group of Velthari students glided past, their crystalline bodies catching the light and throwing rainbows on the walls. Their leader, Crixvel, stood nearly 8 feet tall and spoke in musical tones that translated through Jake's universal communicator. Behind them came 3 Kexnari, moving in perfect synchronization. The insect-like beings shared a hive mind that let them think as one. Their compound eyes reflected everything around them, and Jake always felt like they were analyzing him when they looked his way. He knew they probably were. A warm presence brushed against his shoulder, and Jake turned to see one of the Luminari floating nearby. The energy being had no solid form, existing as a collection of glowing particles that shifted between blue and gold. It pulsed once in what Jake had learned was a greeting, then drifted away toward the advanced physics wing. Jake was one of only 3 humans at the academy. Earth had joined the galactic community just 5 years ago, and humans were still considered newcomers. Most of the other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. Some had built empires that spanned entire sectors of the galaxy. He walked into Professor Zektar's classroom and took his usual seat in the back. The professor was a member of the Karathi, a reptilian species known for their scholarly nature. Zektar's scales were a deep green that darkened when he was thinking hard about something. Today they looked almost black. Lisa Chen, another human student, waved from across the room. She had been studying xenobiology before the academy accepted her application. Her specialty was learning how different species evolved their unique traits. The third human, Danny Foster, sat alone near the front. Danny was quiet most of the time, but Jake had noticed he paid attention to everything. The classroom filled with students from a dozen different worlds. The course was called Primitive Species Evolution, and it focused on civilizations that had recently achieved spaceflight. Jake often wondered why he and the other humans had been placed in this particular class. Professor Zektar entered the room, his clawed feet clicking on the metal floor. He carried a data pad that glowed with information about the day's lesson. His large yellow eyes swept across the students before he began to speak. Today we will examine case studies of species that struggled with basic social controls during their development, he announced. His voice carried the slight hiss that all Karathi possessed. These examples help us understand why some civilizations advance slowly, while others achieve rapid progress. Crixvel raised one crystalline arm. Professor, are we studying the Terran Prohibition again? The Velthari's voice carried amusement that needed no translation. Several students made sounds that Jake recognized as laughter from their respective species. The Kexanari clicked their mandibles in unison. One of the gas-breathing Nexari released a puff of sweet-smelling vapor that indicated humor. Professor Zektar's scales lightened slightly. Indeed, the human alcohol prohibition of the early 20th century remains one of the most fascinating examples of governmental failure in recorded galactic history. Jake felt his face grow warm. He had heard this lecture before, and it never got easier to sit through. The professor activated his holographic display, showing images of Earth during the 1920s and 1930s. The humans, Professor Zektar continued, decided to ban a simple intoxicant that their species had been consuming for thousands of years. The results were predictably disastrous. Crixvel spoke again, and this time, Jake could hear the mockery clearly. How could any species be so primitive? They could not handle basic alcohol, so they banned it entirely. Other students joined in with their species' versions of laughter. A Nexari student named Vorth added, "My people eliminated recreational substances centuries ago. We simply decided they were not useful and stopped using them. No laws were needed." One of the Kexanari, speaking for all 3 through their shared mind, said, The hive determined that intoxicants interfered with collective thought. We ceased their use immediately. No individual resistance occurred. Jake looked around the classroom and saw the same expression on every non-human face. They thought humans were weak and stupid. They saw Prohibition as proof that his species could not control their basic impulses. The humans created vast criminal organizations, Professor Zektar explained, showing images of men in suits carrying weapons. They fought wars in their cities over the right to sell illegal alcohol. Their government lost control of entire regions. A luminary student pulsed with colors that Jake's translator interpreted as confusion. Why did they not simply accept the ban? Surely the law was for their benefit. Crixvel's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with amusement. Because humans are a primitive species. They lack the mental discipline that advanced civilizations possess. They could not overcome their addiction to a simple chemical. Jake clenched his hands under his desk. He wanted to argue, but he knew the facts seemed to support their conclusion. Prohibition had been a failure. Crime had increased. The government had eventually given up and repealed the ban. But there was something about the way they talked about his species that bothered him. They made it sound like humans were children who could not control themselves. They spoke as if Prohibition was just about alcohol and nothing more. Lisa caught his eye from across the room and shook her head slightly. She was telling him not to argue. They had learned early in the semester that defending human history only made things worse. The other students would just point out more examples of human failures. Danny turned in his seat and looked back at Jake. Unlike Lisa, Danny's expression was calm. He did not look embarrassed or angry. He looked like he was waiting for something. Professor Zektar continued his lecture, explaining how other species had handled similar challenges. The Velthari had created collective meditation practices. The Kexnari had simply shared thoughts until individual desires disappeared. The Nexari had used their advanced chemistry to eliminate the biological need for intoxicants. Each of these approaches, the professor concluded, demonstrates the kind of rational thinking that leads to galactic citizenship. The human approach shows what happens when a species lacks such capabilities. The class ended with the non-human students discussing how fortunate they were to belong to advanced civilizations. Jake packed his books and prepared to leave, but Crixvel blocked his path to the door. "Tell me, human," the Velthari said, towering over Jake with his crystalline form catching the light. "How does it feel to know your species was too weak to handle simple alcohol? What other basic challenges might prove too difficult for humans?" Jake looked up at the alien student and felt something cold settle in his stomach. It was not shame or embarrassment. It was something else entirely, something that reminded him of stories his grandfather used to tell about men who smiled while they planned violence. "I guess we will find out," Jake said quietly, and walked past Crixvel toward the door. Behind him, he heard the crystalline being's musical laughter, followed by comments from other students about human weakness and primitive thinking. Jake kept walking, but he noticed that Danny had not moved from his seat. The quiet human was still sitting there looking thoughtful, as if he knew something the rest of them did not. The academy cafeteria buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages. Jake sat at a corner table with Lisa and Danny, picking at his lunch while trying to ignore the stares from other students. Word of the morning's class discussion had spread quickly through the academy's social networks. Lisa stabbed her synthetic protein with more force than necessary. "I am sick of this," she said. "Every day it is the same thing. They act like we are some kind of failed experiment." Danny said nothing, but Jake noticed his friend's jaw was tight. The quiet human had been even more silent than usual since leaving Professor Zektar's classroom. "Maybe we should just ignore them," Jake suggested, though he did not believe his own words. "We only have 2 more months here." 2 more months of being treated like idiots," Lisa replied. "Do you know what Vorth said to me in xenobiology class? He asked if humans had figured out fire yet, or if we were still rubbing sticks together." A group of Velthari students walked past their table. Crixvel stopped and looked down at the 3 humans with what passed for amusement on his crystalline features. "Still discussing your primitive prohibition?" he asked. "Perhaps you could explain to us how banning alcohol led to such chaos. We are curious about the mental processes involved. Jake started to stand, but Danny's hand on his arm stopped him. Let it go, Danny said quietly. Crixvel's crystalline form seemed to glow brighter. Yes, listen to your friend. Violence is not the answer to intellectual challenges, though I suppose that is another human failing we could discuss. Other students began to gather around their table. Jake recognized faces from multiple species, all wearing expressions of curiosity or amusement. He realized they were about to become the center of another public humiliation. Lisa stood up suddenly. You want to know about Prohibition? Fine. Let us show you the real story, not just the simple version Professor Zektar teaches. What do you mean? Asked one of the Kexnari. The insect-like being tilted its head in a gesture Jake had learned indicated confusion. I mean, there are restricted files in the historical archives, Lisa said. Files that explain the full context of what happened, but they require special permission to access. Crixvel's musical laughter filled the air around them. The humans want to show us secret files. How mysterious. What could possibly be hidden about such a simple failure? If it is so simple, Danny said, speaking for the first time, then why are the files restricted? The question seemed to surprise the alien students. A luminary that had been floating nearby pulsed with colors that Jake's translator interpreted as confusion mixed with interest. All historical records are available for academic study, the energy being said. What could require restriction? Lisa looked at Jake, then at Danny. The Terran Diplomatic Corps sealed certain files when Earth joined the galactic community. They said the information was too sensitive for general access. Sensitive how? Crixvel demanded. What could be sensitive about humans failing to control their drinking? Danny stood up slowly. Jake had never seen his friend look quite like this before. There was something cold in Danny's eyes that made Jake think of winter mornings back on Earth. Some things are prohibited not because we cannot handle them, Danny said, his voice quiet but clear, but because we handle them too well. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt something shift in the atmosphere around their table. The alien students were still smiling, but there was uncertainty now mixed with their amusement. What does that mean? Forth asked. The Nexaris, gas-breathing apparatus, hissed as he spoke. It means, Lisa said, that you do not understand what human prohibition really was. You think it was about alcohol. You think it was about weakness. Was it not? Crixvel asked, but his tone was less mocking now. Jake found himself standing without remembering the decision to do so. You want to see the restricted files? Then let us go ask Professor Zektar to access them. Let us show you what really happened during Prohibition. The crowd of alien students exchanged glances. Jake could see them communicating through their various methods. The Kexnari shared rapid thoughts. The Velthari resonated with musical tones too low for human ears. The Luminari pulsed with private colors. Very well, Crixvel said finally. If you believe these files will somehow excuse your species' primitive behavior, we are willing to observe your humiliation. The group moved through the academy corridors like a parade. Word spread quickly through the student networks, and by the time they reached Professor Zektar's office, nearly 40 students from a dozen species had joined them. Professor Zektar looked up from his desk as the crowd filled his office and spilled into the hallway. His scales shifted from green to a worried yellow. What is the meaning of this? He asked. Crixvel stepped forward. The humans claim there are restricted files about their prohibition that will somehow change our understanding of the events. We request access to these files to settle this primitive debate. Professor Zektar's scales darkened. The restricted files are classified for good reason. The standard historical summary is sufficient for educational purposes. Are you afraid of what we might find? Lisa asked. The professor's reptilian eyes narrowed. I am not afraid of anything, Miss Chen. I am following proper academic protocols. Then show us, Danny said. If the files only confirm what we already know, what harm could there be? Jake watched as Professor Zektar considered the request. The alien students were clearly expecting the professor to refuse, which would let them claim the humans were hiding behind excuses. But if he agreed to access the files, they were confident it would only provide more evidence of human failure. Very well, Professor Zektar said finally. But I warn you all, some historical records are restricted because they contain disturbing content. The Galactic Ethics Committee does not seal files lightly. He activated his desk terminal and began entering authorization codes. Jake noticed the professor's claws were moving more slowly than usual, as if he was reluctant to complete the process. The files are marked with unusual warnings, Professor Zektar said, reading from his screen. Multiple advisory notices from the Terran Diplomatic Corps, the Galactic Ethics Committee, and the Interspecies Cultural Studies Division. Warnings about what? Asked one of the Luminari. Sociological impact analysis, the professor replied. Cultural contamination protocols, restricted viewing classifications. Crixvel's crystalline form seemed to pulse with amusement. How dramatic. Warnings about human drinking problems. Professor Zektar's finger hovered over the final authorization key. Are you certain you want to proceed? Once these files are accessed, they cannot be sealed again without a formal review process. The alien students looked at each other with expressions that needed no translation. They were enjoying this too much to back down now. They wanted to see the humans embarrassed in front of the entire academy. Open the files, Crixvel said. Let us see what the humans are so desperate to hide. Professor Zektar pressed the key. His desk screen flashed warnings in multiple languages before displaying a directory of sealed files. Jake could see dozens of entries marked with security classifications he did not recognize. The primary file is marked Classified, Sociological Impact Analysis, Clearance Level 7 Required, Professor Zektar read. It contains video footage and documentation compiled by early galactic observers who were monitoring Earth during the Prohibition period. Video footage? Lisa asked. What kind of video footage? Professor Zektar was reading from the file headers. Observational recordings of human behavior patterns, analysis of organizational development, tactical innovation, documentation. Warning. Content may be disturbing to species unfamiliar with human conflict resolution methods. Danny stepped closer to the professor's desk. Show us the videos. The room fell silent. Jake could hear the hum of the station's life support systems and the distant sound of students in the corridors. Everyone was watching Professor Zektar, waiting for him to make the decision that would change everything. Very well, the professor said, but remember, you insisted on this. He selected the first video file. The screen flickered and began to display grainy footage from what looked like an Earth city in the early 20th century. The timestamp read, Chicago, February 14, 1929. Jake felt his stomach drop as he recognized the date. Beside him, Danny's expression did not change, but his hands slowly curled into fists. The alien students crowded closer to the screen, eager to see more evidence of human weakness and failure. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The first video began playing on Professor Zektar's screen. The image was black and white, grainy like old Earth movies. Jake could see snow on the ground and men in long coats walking down a city street. The timestamp in the corner read, Chicago, February 14th, 1929, 10:47 a.m. What are we looking at? Asked Vorth, his breathing apparatus hissing softly. Professor Zektar read from the file description. This footage was recorded by early galactic observation teams. They were studying human social development during the Prohibition period. Crixvel's crystalline form pulsed with amusement. Galactic observers wasted time watching humans stumble around drunk in the streets? The video showed 7 men entering a building. They wore suits and hats like businessmen. But Jake noticed something in their movements that made his skin crawl. They walked like predators. The file is labeled Human Territorial Dispute Resolution, Alcohol Distribution Rights. Professor Zektar continued reading. Warning. Contains graphic content related to human conflict methodology. One of the Kexnari clicked its mandibles. Conflict over alcohol sales? How primitive can one species be? Lisa moved closer to the screen. What building are they entering? Professor Zektar checked the file notes. A garage. The location was used for illegal alcohol storage and distribution. Two rival human organizations claimed territorial rights to the area. The video quality was poor, but Jake could see more men inside the garage. They were lined up against a brick wall, facing away from the camera. The 7 men who had entered spread out in a line facing them. "This should be amusing," Crixville said. "Are we about to watch humans argue over who gets to sell illegal drinks?" Danny stepped forward until he was almost touching the professor's desk. His voice was very quiet when he spoke. "Professor, what is the exact date of this footage?" Professor Zektar glanced at the timestamp. February 14th, 1929. Does the date have significance? Before Danny could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the video. The alien students jumped back in surprise. On screen, the 7 men were firing weapons at the men against the wall. The sound was sharp and rapid, like metal being torn apart. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of weapons fire from the video. Jake counted the seconds. 15, 20, 30. The shooting seemed to go on forever. When it stopped, 7 men lay motionless on the garage floor. The shooters calmly put away their weapons and walked out of the building as if nothing had happened. "What did we just watch?" asked one of the Luminari. Its energy form flickering between colors that Jake's translator could not interpret. Professor Zektar was reading rapidly from the file notes, his scales shifting from green to pale yellow. This event was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It was a territorial dispute between 2 criminal organizations over alcohol distribution rights in the Chicago area. "They killed 7 beings over alcohol?" Forth asked. "Over the right to sell drinks?" "It gets worse," Danny said quietly. "Show them the analysis files." Professor Zektar opened another document. The Galactic observers compiled detailed reports on this incident. They interviewed survivors and studied the organizational methods involved. He began reading from the analysis. Subject Group Alpha demonstrated advanced tactical planning, coordination, and execution. The operation required detailed intelligence gathering, surveillance of target routines, acquisition of appropriate weapons, and precise timing coordination. Crixville's musical tones carried confusion now instead of amusement. "This was planned? They studied their targets before killing them?" The report continues, Professor Zektar said. "Most significantly, this operation was conducted by individuals with no formal military training. The subjects learned these techniques through practical experience gained during the artificial scarcity period known as Prohibition." Lisa pointed to another section of the file. "Read the part about the weapons." Professor Zektar found the section and continued reading. "The firearms used were modified civilian weapons adapted for rapid fire and concealment. Modifications were performed using standard industrial tools. Technical innovation occurred at the individual level without centralized coordination or formal education. One of the Kexanari spoke for all 3 through their shared mind. They created their own weapons, without training or guidance? There are more videos," Professor Zektar said, scrolling through the file list. "Dozens of them, all from the Prohibition period." He selected another file. This one showed a young human male, probably in his early 20s, sitting across a table from what Jake recognized as an early galactic observer. The alien was hidden in shadow, but its multiple eyes reflected light like a spider's. "State your name and occupation for the record," a translated voice said from off-camera. "Tony Benedetto," the young human replied. "I run distribution for the Southside Territory." "Explain your work methods." Tony leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. "Well, when someone tries to move in on our area, we have to discourage them. Last month, the Irish crew thought they could start selling in our neighborhood. What form did this discouragement take? We talked to them first, polite-like, explained that they were in the wrong place." Tony smiled, and Jake felt cold run down his spine. When talking didn't work, we had to be more direct. Define more direct. Well, we started with their delivery trucks. Couple of small fires, nothing too serious. When that didn't work, we visited their warehouses. Then we had to have personal conversations with their leadership. The observers, multiple eyes glittered in the darkness. How many personal conversations? Tony thought for a moment. 17. In 6 months. After that, they decided to find a different neighborhood. Professor Zektar stopped the video. The classroom was completely silent. Jake looked around at the alien students and saw expressions he had never seen before. The mockery was gone. In its place was something that looked like fear. 17. Killings in 6 months, Vorth whispered, by one young human, and he speaks of it like discussing the weather, added a luminary, its form flickering rapidly between colors. Crixvel's crystalline structure seemed dimmer than before. How many of these territorial disputes occurred during Prohibition? Professor Zektar checked the files. According to the Galactic observers, every major human city experienced similar conflicts. The reports estimate thousands of casualties directly related to alcohol distribution disputes. Thousands? One of the Kexnari asked. Over drinks? Danny finally spoke. You still don't understand. It was never about the alcohol. All eyes in the room turned to him. Jake noticed that several alien students had moved farther away from the 3 humans without seeming to realize it. Then what was it about? Professor Zektar asked. Control, Danny said. Territory, markets, organization. When you tell humans, they can't have something, they don't just break the law. They build new systems, they innovate, they adapt. Lisa opened another file on the professor's screen. Show them the organizational charts. The display filled with complex diagrams showing hierarchical structures, territory maps, and logistics networks. Jake recognized them as the kind of charts used to describe corporate structures or military commands. These diagrams represent the criminal organizations that developed during Prohibition. Professor Zektar read. Note the sophisticated command structures, territorial divisions, and operational specializations. One diagram showed a network spanning multiple cities, with detailed breakdowns of roles, responsibilities, and communication protocols. Another showed financial flows that moved millions of dollars across continents. This level of organizational complexity, Professor Zektar continued reading, exceeded that of most planetary governments of the period. The structures developed spontaneously without central planning or formal education in organizational management. Crixvel's voice was barely audible when he spoke. They built governmental structures to sell illegal alcohol? They built better governmental structures, Danny corrected. More efficient, more responsive to local conditions, more innovative in solving problems. Professor Zektar opened another file. The observers noted that these organizations demonstrated capabilities that would not be invented by most galactic species for centuries. Urban warfare tactics, corruption techniques, intelligence networks, psychological manipulation methods. All this over alcohol prohibition? Asked a luminary. Jake found his voice for the first time since the video started. This is what happens when you tell humans they can't have something. We don't just want it more. We become something different to get it. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Professor Zektar spoke in a voice Jake had never heard before. Uncertain. Almost. Frightened. There are more files. Much more. The Galactic observers spent years studying human behavior during Prohibition. He paused, his scales shifting to colors Jake couldn't identify. According to their conclusions, what we have seen so far represents only the surface level of human adaptation. What do you mean? Crixvel asked, though Jake could tell the crystalline being was not sure he wanted to know. Professor Zektar's claws trembled slightly as he accessed the final section of files. The observers ran comparative analyses. They wanted to understand how different species respond to similar restrictions. The screen filled with data comparing prohibition policies across Mull. Professor Zektar's claws moved slowly across his terminal as he opened the comparative analysis files. The screen filled with data from dozens of worlds, showing how different species had handled similar restrictions throughout galactic history. Galactic observers wanted to understand if human behavior during Prohibition was normal. He read aloud. They studied prohibition policies implemented by 47 different species over the past 3,000 years. Jake watched the alien students' faces as Professor Zektar continued reading. Their expressions had changed completely from the beginning of class. The mockery was gone, replaced by something between fascination and horror. "Let us examine the Kexnari response first," Professor Zektar said, highlighting a section of data. When the hive mind determined that intoxicants interfered with collective thought processes, prohibition was implemented across all 17 Kexnari worlds simultaneously. One of the Kexnari students clicked its mandibles nervously. What was the result? "Complete compliance within 48 hours, Professor Zektar read. No resistance, no black market development. The hive mind simply stopped wanting the prohibited substances. Crime rates remained unchanged. Social structure remained stable." He moved to the next section. The Velthari implemented restrictions on crystalline enhancers approximately 800 years ago. Krixvel's form seemed to dim as he waited for the results. The Velthari formed committees to discuss alternative substances. They composed musical protests expressing their disagreement with the policy. After 6 months of debate, they accepted the restriction and developed meditation techniques to replace the enhancers. No violence occurred. No criminal organizations formed. Professor Zektar continued through the data. The Luminari had simply faded their energy forms when prohibited substances were banned, entering a collective state of peaceful disappointment. The Nexari had held poetry contests to express their feelings about restriction, then found new recreational activities. Every species studied, Professor Zektar said, his voice growing quieter, responded to prohibition with some form of peaceful compliance. Protests were formal and legal. Alternative activities were developed through official channels. Crime rates either decreased or remained stable. Lisa leaned forward. "What about humans?" Professor Zektar opened the human data file. The room fell silent as numbers and charts filled the screen. Jake felt sick looking at the statistics. Human prohibition of alcohol lasted 13 years, Professor Zektar read. During this period, violent crime increased by 300% in major cities. Organized criminal enterprises grew from small local groups to continent-spanning networks employing hundreds of thousands of individuals. He scrolled to another section. Government corruption increased by over 500%. Police, judges, politicians, and federal agents were systematically compromised. Entire city governments were controlled by criminal organizations. "That cannot be accurate," Forth said, his breathing apparatus hissing rapidly. "The observers verified these numbers through multiple independent sources," Professor Zektar replied. "They also noted that humans developed new forms of violence specifically adapted to urban environments. Weapons were modified for concealment and rapid use. Tactical innovations spread between cities without formal communication networks." Danny stepped closer to the screen. "Show them the innovation timeline." Professor Zektar found the section Danny requested. A timeline appeared showing technological and tactical developments during the Prohibition years. Jake read through the list with growing unease. Thompson's submachine guns adapted for civilian use. Armored vehicles disguised as delivery trucks. Explosive devices designed for building destruction. Communication codes for coordinating multi-city operations. Professor Zektar paused. All of these innovations occurred within the first 5 years of Prohibition. They invented new ways to kill people, asked a Luminari, its energy form flickering rapidly. They invented new ways to organize, communicate, and control territory, Danny corrected. Violence was just one tool among many. Professor Zektar opened another file. The observers were particularly interested in human learning curves. They documented how quickly criminal organizations adapted to law enforcement tactics. The screen showed charts tracking the evolution of criminal methods over time. Each time police developed new strategies, criminal organizations countered within months. When federal agents infiltrated groups, new security protocols appeared. When communication lines were intercepted, new codes were created. It was like watching an arms race, Professor Zektar read from the observer notes. But instead of governments competing against each other, It was criminals competing against their own government. And the criminals were winning. Krixvel's crystalline form was barely glowing now. Winning against their own government? By the end of Prohibition, Professor Zektar continued, criminal organizations controlled alcohol distribution in every major American city. They had corrupted law enforcement at every level. They generated more revenue than most legitimate businesses. They employed more people than many government departments. Jake watched the alien students process this information. He could see them trying to understand how any species could respond to restriction by building parallel power structures. The most disturbing observation, Professor Zektar read, was the casual efficiency with which humans eliminated competitors. Violence was not emotional or chaotic. It was calculated, planned, and executed with precision. He opened another video file. This one showed a meeting between several well-dressed humans in what looked like a restaurant. The audio quality was poor, but Jake could make out most of the conversation. "The problem is the O'Malley crew," one man was saying. "They're moving into our territory again." "How do you want to handle it?" asked another. "Same as always. Start with their trucks, move to their warehouses, finish with their leadership if necessary." "How many trucks?" "All of them. Make sure the message is clear." The conversation continued for several minutes, discussing logistics, timing, and personnel assignments with the calm efficiency of a business meeting, which Jake realized was exactly what it was. "They planned violence like scheduling deliveries," whispered one of the Kexanari. Professor Zektar stopped the video and opened the final section of the comparative analysis. The observer's conclusions are what led to these files being classified. The screen displayed a summary report marked, with warnings in multiple languages. Professor Zektar began reading the most important sections. Quote, "Human response to prohibition differs fundamentally from all other studied species. Where other species adapt their desires to match restrictions, humans adapt their environment to circumvent restrictions. This adaptation occurs at speeds that suggest prohibition acts as an evolutionary pressure, accelerating innovation and organizational development." Lisa pointed to another paragraph. "Read the part about capability assessment." Professor Zektar found the section and continued. Quote, "Most concerning is the apparent limitlessness of human adaptation. When standard criminal methods proved insufficient, humans invented new ones. When existing organizational structures proved inadequate, humans created better ones. The only limiting factor appears to be time, not capability." The room was completely silent. Jake could hear the hum of the station's life support systems and the distant sound of other classes in session. Normal academy life continuing while their worldview collapsed. "There is one final observation," Professor Zektar said quietly, "the one that led to immediate classification of these files." He highlighted the last paragraph of the report. His voice was barely audible as he read. Quote, "Recommendation. Under no circumstances should humans be denied access to desired substances or activities. The organizational and tactical capabilities demonstrated during artificial scarcity periods suggest that prohibition does not reduce harmful behavior in humans. Instead, it transforms individual problems into systematic threats that can exceed the complexity and power of planetary governments. The risk of prohibition for this species is not addiction or social decay, but the evolution of superior competing power structures." Jake felt the weight of every alien gaze in the room. They were looking at him, Lisa, and Danny with expressions he had never seen before. Fear, yes, but also something like respect. The kind of respect usually reserved for dangerous predators. "Is this true?" Krixvel asked, his musical voice barely a whisper. "Do humans really respond to restrictions by building better systems to bypass them?" Danny looked directly at the crystalline being. "What do you think happened when Earth was denied membership in the galactic community for 50 years? The question hung in the air like a threat. Jake realized that every alien in the room was now thinking about human space exploration, human technology development, human diplomatic and military capabilities. They were wondering what humans had built while waiting for acceptance into galactic. Society. Professor Zektar closed the files with shaking claws. Class dismissed, he said quietly. But nobody moved. They all stood there, staring at the three humans who had just become something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The silence in Professor Zektar's office stretched on for what felt like hours. Jake could see the alien students trying to process what they had learned. Their entire understanding of humanity had been turned upside down in the space of a single class period. Finally, one of the Luminari spoke, its energy form pulsing with confused colors. If this analysis is correct, then Prohibition was not a failure of human willpower. It was a demonstration of human capability. Professor Zektar nodded slowly, his scales still pale with shock. The galactic observers reached the same conclusion. What other species saw as chaos and criminality, they recognized as rapid organizational evolution. Crixwell stepped closer to Danny, but Jake noticed the crystalline being maintained more distance than before. You said Prohibition ended because humans could not handle what they became. What did you mean? Danny was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. By 1933, the criminal organizations had become more powerful than the government that created Prohibition. They controlled entire cities. They had their own armies, their own intelligence networks, their own diplomatic relationships with each other. He paused, looking around the room at the alien faces. The government realized they had accidentally created dozens of competing nations inside their own borders. Nations that were better organized, better funded, and more efficient than the official government. Lisa picked up the explanation. So they ended Prohibition not because crime was too high, but because the criminals had become too successful. Too successful at what? Asked Vorth, his breathing apparatus working faster than normal. At being a government, Jake said, understanding for the first time what his friends had been trying to tell him. They were collecting taxes. They called them protection fees. They were settling disputes between citizens. They were providing services the official government could not provide. They were governing. Professor Zektar opened another file on his terminal. The observers noted this pattern. By the end of Prohibition, criminal organizations were performing governmental functions more effectively than the official government. The screen showed organizational charts comparing the structure of criminal enterprises to legitimate government departments. The similarities were obvious and disturbing. They had departments for intelligence gathering, territory management, conflict resolution, financial operations, and public relations, Professor Zektar read. They maintained diplomatic relationships with each other, including formal treaties and trade agreements. One of the Kexnari clicked its mandibles nervously. They created their own civilization. A more efficient civilization, Danny corrected. One that worked better than the system that tried to stop them. Crixwell's form was barely glowing now. What happened to these organizations when Prohibition ended? Some went legitimate, Lisa said. They used their money and connections to start legal businesses. Others moved into different illegal activities. But the organizational knowledge never disappeared. It was passed down through families and communities. Jake felt compelled to add something that had been bothering him since the video started. The observers called it organizational evolution. But that makes it sound like it was slow and gradual. It was not. Humans built continent-spanning criminal empires in less than 5 years. From nothing, Danny emphasized. No blueprints, no textbooks, no formal training. Just humans responding to restriction by creating better systems. Professor Zektar was reading through more observer notes. There is additional analysis here about human innovation under pressure. The observers noted that Prohibition-era humans developed techniques that would later be used in legitimate businesses, military operations, and government agencies, such as, asked a Luminari, corporate intelligence gathering, multi-jurisdictional operations, franchise business models, public relations and image management, financial laundering and accounting techniques. Professor Zektar paused. Many of these innovations were not seen in other galactic civilizations for centuries after humans developed them. The implications of this statement settled over the room like a cold wind. Jake realized what the aliens were thinking. If humans could innovate so rapidly under Prohibition pressure, what were they capable of when that pressure was removed? Crixfell asked the question that everyone was thinking. Professor, what does the current analysis say about human capabilities now that they have joined Galactic Society? Professor Zektar's claws hesitated over his terminal. There is a supplementary file. Updated observations from the past 5 years. Show us, Danny said quietly. The professor opened the file reluctantly. The screen filled with recent data about human space exploration, technology development, and diplomatic activities since joining the galactic community. Human technological advancement has accelerated since galactic contact, Professor Zektar read. Integration of galactic technologies with human innovations has produced hybrid systems that exceed the capabilities of either parent technology. Jake saw several alien students exchange worried glances. Human diplomatic relationships have expanded rapidly across multiple species and political systems. Trade agreements have been established with civilizations that typically require decades of negotiation to approach. How rapidly? Asked Forth. Most of these agreements were completed within 18 months of first contact, Professor Zektar replied. The average time for new species to establish similar relationships is 40 to 60 years. Lisa leaned forward. What about military capabilities? Professor Zektar found that section. Human military technology has been enhanced with galactic innovations, but observers note that humans have also enhanced galactic technology with human innovations. The resulting hybrid systems are concerning. Concerning how? Crixfell demanded. Human tactical thinking combined with galactic technology has produced capabilities that did not exist in either system independently, Professor Zektar read. Observer recommendation. Monitor human military development closely. Innovation. Rate suggests exponential capability growth. Danny spoke into the silence that followed. You wanted to know if humans still have the organizational capabilities we demonstrated during Prohibition. He gestured toward the screen full of data about human achievements since joining Galactic Society. What do you think? Jake watched. The alien students processed this information. They were beginning to understand that Prohibition had not been about human weakness. It had been a demonstration of human strength directed toward solving the problem of restriction. There is one final note, Professor Zektar said quietly. Added to the file just last month. He opened the most recent entry. Quote, human integration into galactic society has proceeded faster than any previous species. Adaptation to new technologies, social systems, and political structures has been remarkably rapid. Of particular note is the human tendency to improve upon galactic systems rather than simply adopting them. The professor continued reading. Quote, recommendation. Ensure human satisfaction with current galactic arrangements. Historical evidence suggests that restricted or excluded humans do not accept limitations. They build superior alternatives. The room was completely silent. Jake realized that every alien in the room was now looking at him, Lisa, and Danny with a mixture of fear and respect. They finally understood what Danny had meant about handling things too well. Crixfell spoke first, his musical voice uncertain. Is it true that your species still has these capabilities? Danny shrugged, the casual gesture somehow more threatening than any boast could have been. We prefer not to find out. One by one, the alien students began leaving the office. They moved quietly, avoiding eye contact with the humans. Jake noticed they gave the three of them much more space than they had that morning. Soon only Jake, Lisa, Danny, and Professor Zektar remained in the office. The professor was staring at his terminal screen, his scales shifting through colors Jake had never seen before. I have been teaching comparative civilizations for 30 years, Professor Zektar said finally. I thought I understood the patterns of species development. And now? Lisa asked. Now I understand why these files were classified. The professor closed his terminal and looked directly at the three humans. Your species does not follow the normal patterns. You do not adapt to restrictions, you evolve past them. Jake, Lisa, and Danny walked through the academy corridors toward the cafeteria. The other students they passed nodded respectfully instead of staring with amusement. Word had spread quickly through the Academy's communication networks. They sat at their usual table, but Jake noticed that other students were giving them much more space than before. The mockery was gone, replaced by something that looked like nervous respect. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Jake asked quietly. Danny looked around the cafeteria at the alien students who were trying not to stare at them. They needed to understand. Better they learn the truth from historical files than discover it some other way. Lisa nodded toward a group of Velthari students at a nearby table. "Look at how they are sitting now." Jake looked and realized what she meant. The crystalline beings were positioned so they could see the human table clearly. They were not afraid exactly, but they were being very careful. Is that better or worse than being mocked? Jake wondered. "It is Hone,"